All right, and we're back, and hopefully let's check and see how that works. If someone can check me before I go into it, and then I can erase the recording if I have to, and then just do a recording later on. Like I'll just pop it up on YouTube later. For those people watching remotely, I apologize. It is COMP1004 Rapid Application Development. It is the fall 2016 semester, and it's week 3, part 2 of our broadcast. We had a bit of a hiccup. That's a weird time zone. It's a bit of, is it okay now? Okay, it was a bit of a hiccup with the last recording, not sure why, but I've plugged in directly with the wired connection, so Ethernet, and that should help us out. So what we're talking about is some built-in functions, math round, math power, math square, and min-max. Min-max is a really good method because it's like I have two numbers and I want to find the, which one's maximum or minimum. And the reason for this is because it's better than writing your own. I'll tell you why. Because imagine if I say, well, if it's this, then that. If this, then that. It's like a really simple, stupid method, and so it's built in, right? So this is why we want to use the built-in methods. They're actually done very nicely from C#, and if it's already done for you, why kind of reinvent the wheel? So I'm not going to go into different options here, but they do give you examples of how to use these methods, which is really cool. So if you need to know how to round and so on. And it tells you how many significant digits and so on, and you can see the result on the right side. Joining strings together. There's a couple ways of joining strings together in C#. The main way we use it, and this is the lazy man's way, if you will, or lazy woman's way, if you're a lady programmer, is the plus. And we use the same methodology when we use JavaScript, and Java even will work. PHP is a little different. You have to use a dot, right? But more or less, it's the plus. And what it does is it concatenates one string plus a space in this case, and then the other string, and puts them all together and stores them inside the name, right? So we've seen that before. Appending one string to the other. There are also string escape sequences, same escape sequences that exist in C-style languages. I'm not going to go into those too much, and we're going to skip through this just to make sure that you've seen everything here. So it's not like you've never seen these things before, because that would be a very, very bad thing. Okay. There's a couple of other ones. There is the string class. Now this is not a string as per se the string that you kind of data type. There's the string class, and you can use the string formatting, the string class to do formatting, which we've kind of seen before. We did this last week, the toString method. We use the toString method to convert to currency, right? And there are some shortcuts to what those are. Now these are the conversion methods, 2 decimal, 2 double, 2 int32, toString. There's also, when you convert, you can also convert to single. To single is converting to float if you need to do that. It's not listed here. Okay, so that's one of the ones you'll want to use. Again, what we want to do is when we implicitly call the toString method, we try and convert something that is another data type to a string, right? So we implicitly convert. And we explicitly convert by using either try parse, right? Or we can use something like the toString method. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the conversions, but this is really an important slide. So slide 36, if you want to know all the different kinds, if you want a percent, then you would use P or capital P or lowercase p. Number, float, digits, exponents, these are all important things to note because it'll reshape your string to accommodate a different format. And beyond this, if you say C2, it's currency with 2 decimal places. That's what it's going to be. And we've seen that last week. This is just a review. And here's some examples of how all those things work. Floating point with 3 decimal places. That's what that is, right? Okay, so I'm not going to go too much into detail here. And the rest is really, it talks about scope. You guys should all know that there's different scopes. Mostly there's 3 types of scopes typically. Global scope, which for the most part we will not be dealing with when we program with C#. There's class scope, which is if I have a class member or a field, right? It'll be available to anything in that class. There's method scope, so anything inside a method, right? Then there's some kind of functional scope. Like for example, what I mean by that is if I declare a variable inside of a for loop. Kind of weird. But sometimes we need to do that, or instead of a while loop. Some kind of a looping structure, we declare a variable. We can do that. We can also declare a variable inside of an if statement, right? It only lives and dies between those curly braces, right, in that code block. And there's other places we can also declare variables, but the lifetime of a variable where it lives and dies is in the curly braces that it's been declared, right? So if it's been declared in the curly braces that is part of the class, and this is just a review for this kind of stuff, then it's going to be available to anywhere in the class, including all the methods, right? Also, I want you to think about scope. One more thing it doesn't talk about here because we haven't talked about classes until up until now, is it also depends on the access modifier. Sometimes the variable might be class scope, but it's not available outside the class because it's private, right? So remember that the 3 access modifiers we're going to be seeing a lot are private, public, and protected, right? Remember what's protected? And remember it's the same keyword in Java. Anyone remember what that is?
Package level or within the hierarchy of inheritance.
Yes, that's good that you said inheritance. So it means that you can, subclasses that inherit from the superclass, as long as the variable the variable access modifier is protected, then the subclasses can also access that variable. However, I highly recommend against using it. From a code standards perspective, we want to use private and protected for the most part. Sorry, private and public, those two, and mostly private. And again, like I said before, private instance variables and public properties. That's the way we want to do it. That adheres to the whole object-oriented standards, right? So we can have information hiding, and it's all about that. So think about that. So always try and use private as much as possible. Okay, so scope. We're not going to be talking too much about this. This is just style. Enums. Now this is kind of weird, and I want to set up an enum in my project. This is a great place to actually do some hands-on stuff, because whenever I do enums, people are like confused, right? And I also want to talk about the class diagram, which we can also use today, which is part of the Visual Studio IDE, which is not part of any other IDE that I've ever seen. Let's take a look. So here's my project. I want to make a new project today. All right, so let's do it together. So new project. And what I want to do is under C#, I want to click on Windows Forms application, just like before. I'm just going to name mine COMP1004, and it's fall 2016 and lesson 3. Obviously, I'm going to put it in the right folder, so it's going to go into the COMP1004 folder. And I'm also going to add it to Git. Now, if you don't have Git access by now, that would be very bad, right? But I'm going to add it to the Git, like a new Git repository for my solution, right? And press OK. It's going to do its dance and deploy a new basic forms application. Notice that when it comes up, and you're going to see this in a second, my form is called Form 1. Form 1, if you left your form as Form 1 for your assignment 1, you would lose marks. Because inside your document, if you read it carefully, from a standards perspective, I've asked you for your application structure, your form should be called something, and it's inside your assignment. Please be careful, read the fine detail. You'll probably lose a mark if you leave it as Form 1. Now you might say, well, why? Because what if I have 5 forms, 10 forms? They're going to be called Form 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Makes no sense. Call them what they're supposed to do, just like we name our objects. So example, Form 1. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to call this, Start Form or something. Call it something we don't know what we're building today, as an example. So for now, let's just call it Start Form. And we can do rename here. We can also click in here once and rename it this way as well. We don't have to do a rename. And for example, if I call this Start Form, right? Again, I'm using upper camel case here. So both the first letter and for every word, I'm renaming it. It's going to ask you, when you first do this, do you want to propagate the change? And I'm going to say yes, right? And now Start Form is going to be the name of the form. Okay, but this is great, but I'm talking about enums. Let's also add something new. This is something outside of the book, right? So I'm going to right-click on my project, and I'm going to go Add, New Item. And for some people who've got me for Comp 2007, you've seen this before, so I know you're not going to be impressed, but it's impressive to me, right? So, yes. Right-click on the project, Add, New Item. And then you're going to search for diagram. Just type in the word diagram, right? It comes up with something called class diagram. Let's leave it as class diagram. Just don't call it class diagram 1, just call it class diagram and press enter. What this is going to do is it's going to create this empty canvas for you. Nice, right? So let's say you don't know how to code. Right? Let's just put it out there, right? And you want to create a class, all right? Or you want to create an enum, right? This is a great place to do this. But also, if I drag an existing class inside this canvas, like Start Form, right? It's going to create the shape of my class. It's going to show me the shape of my class right here. It's going to show me all the fields, right? And if you notice up here on the top, there's different levels of detail that you can ask for. For example, just the display name, or I can display the name and type, or I can go, give me the full display, the full signature of my entire class and all the methods. So click on this, and you can see now that I get the entire signature, right? And if I click on this, if I believe, adjust shapes width, then you can see this is what my class looks like. So it's a visual representation of my class in C#. Now you might say, oh, who cares, right? But I can make a class right here too, right? Example, I can right click anywhere in this area and I can add a class, right? Yes? Say that? Kind of, but what it's like, because it does, Visual Studio does UML diagrams too. This isn't that. This is like a UML diagram, but it uses the whole, I'm going to visually create, that's why it's called Visual C#, by the way, if you ever have a question about that. I can visually create my classes through the diagram, right? So an example of this is if I want to create another class, I can do that. Or an enum, right? Let's do an enum. So this is the one we're talking about today. So an enum, and notice that it's going to ask me for an enum. Let's talk about, you know, I want to get this example going in your mind about, I'm a crazy D&D fanatic. I play Dungeons and Dragons, right? Or if you played a role-playing game, who's ever played a role-playing game in your life, right? Probably most of you now. Before, by the way, when we were kids, I was like the only one. I was like the nerd in the class, right? But nowadays, it's cool to be nerdy, right? So let's suppose, right, I want to build a character class. And this is the, right-click, add enum. So let's suppose I want to have an enum that represents, right? Yes? Yeah, see that? See how it dropped? Like we keep losing, it's not me, we keep losing internet access here. It keeps dropping in and out. See if it comes back in a second. Because I am streaming, right? So you can hear my voice, but you can't hear my, yeah. So what happens is we're dropping in and out. Like I'm not, it's not me, it's the actual, that's weird. See, it dropped out and then it goes back to its defaults, right? Which is really weird. And break, when we take a break, I'll reboot just to make sure it's not me, 100%. But that's really weird that I went to that. I'm going to have to put these up on YouTube later. I'm not going to stop recording at this point. I'm just going to keep going. And then later on, I'll put up the recordings later on. So I apologize for people watching at home. This is an imprecise science, right, to do this broadcasting stuff at this point. All right, so I want to have an enum, and I'm thinking about in my mind how I want to represent everything. Okay, so I want to give all my characteristics, right, for my character class. I want to give it names. So I want to say my, for example, I want to kind of put a list of different characteristics. So for example, strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, and charisma, right? Those kind of things. And I can do that by making an enum called abilities, right? So we can do that. So I say abilities, right? Notice that it's a new file that's going to be called abilities.cs. And if I press OK, right, I can see that I have a fresh canvas of this stuff that has nothing in it. We'll look at the abilities enum later on, but let's take a look. So if I right-click now, I can add a member, right? And I can do this visually. So I can sit there and go, okay, I want to add a field. So one of them is going to be called, let's say, strength, right? And then I can add another one. And I can keep adding different fields when it allows me to. All right, so there's strength. So right-click, add a new member, right? So it's, let's say, dexterity. Why am I doing this? You're going to say, because dexterity and strength are really long numbers, or really long names, but they're also going to be assigned a number value, starting at 0, right? So this will be constitution. Good luck to spell it, right? If you don't know, if you've never played D&D before, you won't be able to. Add member, maybe you will. Intelligence, right? And let's do add member wisdom, right? And we'll say add member charisma. Charisma, let's rename. X for people who came in late. Charisma, all right. So if you notice, this is my enum, and it's kind of a visual representation of an object called abilities, this abilities enum. It's not a class per se. It's just a way of me referring to an object, almost like I'm creating a data type that has a bunch of different values: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. And these values that I've got in here, they're values that we can look at, and they mean something to us, as opposed to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or whatever it is. Those numbers don't mean anything to us, but we could use a representation to represent something else. Yes? Yes, exactly what we're going to do. So example would be if I want to have an array of an ability array, right? I can use a word to represent that position, the index, as opposed to a number, because numbers don't mean anything to us. So if I say something like this, ability 0, what's ability 0? It means nothing. You have to remember what it is. And if you were coming in and looking at that code for the very first time, you'd be like, I don't know what ability 0 means. Let's look, you'd have to look all over the place to figure it out, right? Unless I put some comments in there that says ability 0 means strength, right? However, if I go ability and in quotations I put strength, right? Okay, I understand. It's the strength ability, right? That's what it means, right? So I know that right away, and it saves you. It makes code a little bit more clear, is what it does, and solves some problems too. All right, this is nice, but what does it actually give us? And we're going to talk about enums in general a little bit more in the future. But if I double-click on my abilities.cs file, this is what you get. So it actually codes it for you, right? So I've got a public enum called abilities, and I've got strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Now, in order for me to use the enum, how do I do it? I have to declare a variable with type of the enum. So my data type would be abilities, right? If you understand what I'm saying, right? The ability variable, right? That's one way of doing it. Or I can use it as a static object if I don't want to do that. Let's take a look at some examples. So again, the enumeration name, and if I want to, I can assign a type if I want to, or it can infer a type depending on what I reference to it. Also, I can set this up. If I hover over it, notice that by default I get numbers. These represent numbers, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, this is one type of enum. I want to get you to understand what an enum is used for before we actually use it. Let's go back to the class diagram, and let's say we're making a game. So this is one type of enum, and here's another way of doing an enum. It's a great way of keeping track of the states of a game. An example would be my start menu. My start menu would be 0, right? So if I go to my start menu, that would be 0. Instead of me going to the 0th scene, right, I'm going to go to my start menu scene. It makes more sense. The word is more readable to us than 0. It doesn't make any sense. I can also change these values, like I said. So start menu would be 1. Maybe I'd have an instruction screen. Then I'm going to have a gameplay screen, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. And they have representations in an enum as opposed to a number. That's what I'm talking about. I could do that too. That's a very good way of doing it, right? Because enums could be anything, right? Now I also want you to think of this, right? Right now our enum starts counting at 0. Notice that if I hover over strength, right, as an example, it doesn't give us anything here. But inside my abilities, if I hover over it to give a code hinting, I get the ability strength is equal to 0 because that's the default. However, I can make it equal to start at a different number. Like let's say, for example, I want strength for whatever reason to start at 1. That's good. I can save that. And now if I go to dexterity, it's 2. Right? So you can number them, start the numbering any way you like, if it makes sense for your application, right? Example, days of the week, right? We don't want day of the week being 0. We want day of the week being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? Sometimes that's more effective. So if I was going to make an enum with Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Sunday, I'd start Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, then I would start Sunday at day 1, not day 0, right? Because maybe that makes more sense for me, right? Depending on how I'm programming. And that's what this is all for. It's just a representation, a number representation in some kind of readable format that we can use, for example, inside of a generic, like a list, or another value like an array. Yes?
Can you also do the same thing with other languages like Java?
Yeah, enum works Java. It also works in C#, C++. It can even work with JavaScript, right, if you use something called TypeScript, which is the language of choice when it comes to programming in JavaScript these days. Yes. Yeah, any C-influenced language pretty much has it. Swift is weird when it comes to enums, but we'll talk about that when we see each other again in mobile programming. Okay. So enums. So I just wanted to use this as an explanation piece, right? Here's something else that you can do with the class diagram. If I right-click the class diagram, you can see that if you look further down, there's class details, right? If I click class details, you also get this little pull down that tells you more details of the class itself. And if I pin it, right? Okay, I want to show you the difference here. So it's different than the class diagram. It actually gives me the ability for me to see some of the methods that are included, right? As well as properties that are in the class. Like for example, I don't have any class properties for my start form right now, right? Because my form is pretty much empty, right? If I look at my form, here's my start form, there's nothing in it. I got nothing, right? But as I start adding it in, by the way, the class diagram looks at the entire class, not just the partial part that we see. Remember, when we look at this class, if I was going to look at the start form, in this form we see the visual designer that allows us to look at the actual form itself. And then we have a code behind file, right? So if I right-click and kind of look at View Code, which is F7, the shortcut, right? We can see that we have the visual designer, which would be here, right? Or nope, we didn't actually see this. Let's try this again. I wanted to point at the right thing, the start form. That's what I really wanted. View Code. So if I look at the start form, right, you can see that I have a partial class, right? And I only see the constructor start form, right? But if I go back to my class diagram, I don't just see start form, but I see a bunch of other stuff, right? Where this is coming from, the other side, which is the start form designer. So if I click on start form designer, you can see that this is the other side of the class. Remember partial classes that are split across two different files. How are we doing now? Am I still being seen, or do you still see my face? And that's all you see for those people who are watching remotely. I don't know. Who knows if I dropped? Okay. So we have the dispose. Here's the dispose method, as well as, if you look through some of these other things, the initialize component method that has different components that I'm initializing. And this is where, without coding anything, this is where all the objects are going to be included inside the initialize component method. So if I go to my start form design on the design side and drop in a couple of buttons, let's do that. So I'm going to go into my toolbox. Here it is. And I'm going to drag in a common control. Let's drag in a button, right? So here we go. Here's the button. And once I've dragged in that control and I start looking at it, so if I go into properties for the button, let's pin the properties in, right? And let's unpin the Solution Explorer, so I just see properties, right, for the button. I can see that the button right now has my text as button 1, and I want to make this next. I want to go to the next form, right? And of course this would be called the next button. That's the right name of the button, right? Next button. Remember the name of the control? Button plus next, yes. Your toolbox is empty because you have to click on the right area if you have to click inside the designer for you to see your toolbox. If you don't click on the designer, right, then your toolbox will be empty. All right? All right, so this is one. The other thing is that the form itself, the button is pretty small, so I can make the button, I can resize the button to whatever size I want, and I can also change the custom font size for the button. If I go to font, let's change this like we've shown you before. Let's make this something much bigger, like 12 point Lucida Sans, right? There it is, Lucida Sans, 12 points, and there's my button. You can see it's a much bigger button than before. Okay, cool. Well, this is nice, but what does it do to my designer, right? So my class diagram, what does it do? Well, and let me just hide some of this stuff so you can see it again, right? Well, let's take a look. Did it do anything? Well, no, because it's inside the initialize component. That's where all that stuff just got added in. And if you look at that, if I look at my start form designer, you can see now that all this stuff has been added into my initialize component on the designer side. Again, there's two parts of a form. Actually, there's three parts, right? The design, what you can see, visual designer. Then there's the back-end code, the CS file, and also the designer.cs file. The designer.cs file basically describes each of the objects that exist on your form, that we've kind of dragged and dropped onto your form. That's what this is. Do I want you to work in the designer? No, but I want you to know that it exists, because this is where we can solve problems if your form somehow breaks and you can't see your form anymore because you removed an event, right? Which is what happens. All right, so we can close this off. So the class diagram, what it does, the class diagram itself shows us that it also, kind of derives from the form class. Take a look at this. We have the class diagram, and then there's this little arrow that points to form. See that? I can also choose to show here, right here. See class, and then underneath that there's a little arrow that points to form. I can also choose to show the base class, right? The base class is the superclass. If I click that, you're going to see this massive class that comes up in a second. Wait for it. It's going to take time for it to come up. All right, let's take a look at this massive class. This is the superclass of all form classes, right? And if I expand it, I'm going to use this expand key to fit in. This is what it looks like. This is the actual class that it derives from. And notice the syntax that we have, or the visual syntax we get here. I get this arrow that points from my start form to my subclass, or my superclass. This is the subclass, right? And notice that it's fairly large. Like, these are all the properties with the wrench. Wrench means properties. And all the methods, this little cube, right? All the methods that are included inside of my form, plus all of the events that are kind of done for my form, right? These are all the events that have been defined, plus a bunch of other nested types, right? So that's a pretty huge class. But I'm going to ask you this question, all right? So again, this is object-oriented, programming concept 101, right? Which class is bigger? My superclass or my subclass? Which class is bigger? I'm going to ask you this in a test, yeah. My subclass, this class here, even though it appears to be smaller physically in the visual designer, it includes all this stuff plus other stuff, right? That's why the subclass is always going to be bigger in shape than the superclass. Always, 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 right? And when we look at these classes, and when I say the shape of my class, that's actually a term we're going to use in programming going forward, right? Or the shape of my method. It means all the components that are inside of that class that create the shape. So my shape of my form class, the superclass, looks like this. It has all these properties and methods, right? And this shape of my start form includes all this. It clones all this stuff. Dismiss. I don't want to ever upgrade. See, it's stupid Windows 10. It includes everything here plus new stuff. Okay. So Enum. So I wanted to explain Enum that way, and by the way, I can hide this if I right-click again. If I want to, right now it's show. I can also get rid of it. If I want to get rid of it, I can just not include it. I can cut it out, right? The whole thing. I don't have to show. It's not going to affect my solution. All it is a representation of the classes that exist in my solution. And sometimes we want to put them in place so we can visually see what our classes are. Or if I want to define a class here, and this is another way to do that. Let's say, for example, I want to create a character class, right? And I don't want to type it by hand. And I haven't done C# before. I'm coming from Java, like many of you, right? I want to right-click. I'm going to add a new class right here in the designer. And we're going to call this capital C character, right? Here's my character class, right? And press enter. Okay, so here's my class. It's pretty empty right now. I wanted to define in my character class some of my abilities, right? Now there's a couple ways to do this. I could define my abilities, right, as individual strings, right? Or I could create a string array, right, with a certain length, with a bunch of ability enums, right, that kind of define what the abilities are. It really depends on what you want to do. For now, and I recommend this, we talked about enum, let's get rid of it for now. And I want you to talk about, I'm using the designer for us to create things by hand. We'll include, the enum's not gone, by the way. I've just removed it from the diagram, right? Yes?
So when you look at simply our closing the little space, it's still there.
Yeah, so if I go to Solution Explorer, you can see that everything is here. Like even my character is still there, right? And here's my abilities. It's not gone. I'm just removing it from the diagram, right? Like for example, my start form, I can remove that from the diagram too. If I want to work on a particular class, I can use this as a palette for me to work and to add things into my project, right? So My character class, I'm going to need some abilities. And those abilities, there's going to be two parts to those abilities. There's going to be the instance variables or members that are going to exist in my class. And there's going to be my public properties that are going to refer to these members, right? We talked about this before. So how do I do that? So right click, add a new, now look at, there's property fields, which are the instance variables, all right, or events. There's also the constructor. Do I want to make a constructor for the class? I can add those separately as well. Most times I do not need a destructor because garbage collection is taken care of automatically for you in C#, and you want to do that for the most part, let it do it on its own. Okay? But sometimes we have to do garbage collection manually. Okay, so let's add in a field. And when I add in fields, I want them to be private, right? But I want you to use the underscore. So for example, the underscore would be strength. So here's my strength field, right? Now, by chance, if I do this and I add a field like strength, and I'm not going to do all of them because I think you can figure out what I'm trying to do here, right? We will add this in later on, but I want you to see, if I right-click and go to my class details, right, you can see that, I'm going to pin this up for a second, you can see that in the class details, it's decided that strength is an integer, which is wrong, right? Well, you can change that by basically double-clicking and change this to a string, right? So you can actually align this as string. It'll show it up here in my class. It also makes it private, which is correct. I want to make my members, my fields, all private, right? And I'm using the underscore to denote that it is private. So when we look at the class for the first time, I know it's hard to see. When we look at the class diagram, right, we can look at, when I see an underscore, I know it's a private field. That's what I'm looking at right now. And all my fields pretty much should be private. I can also have, I'm just going to do one, and you can do the other ones if you want to try this out. Yes? I don't know if I can do it here because this is, oh, maybe I can. There we go. Is that better? Yeah. Right. So what I'm doing here, so again, this is all context sensitive down here. If I want to add in a property, right? I can do that too. I can right click, I can add in a property, right? So let's go to this. Property, here we go. And my property, now it's going to add a shortcut for the property, but I'm going to call this strength with a capital S, right? So strength, right? So my property itself is going to be publicly, I can see it publicly, right? Because usually it's public properties and private instance variables. So it's casted correctly, public, but this is wrong. I'm going to make this a string, right? Okay, so I've done this here in my Visual Designer as an example. How do I change this in code, right? So I'm going to go back to my Solution Explorer, and I'm going to double click on my character class. Here's my character class. And when it comes up, I'm just going to get rid of this. You can see that it's scaffolded it out. And it's done nicely too, by the way. So here's how we can fix the public property here. We know that when I get, I'm going to return, right? All I did is clicked on my character.cs class. That's how I got this, by the way, right? I can return, right? This dot underscore strength, right? That's what when you do the getter, that's what it does. It returns a value, right? And the setter sets a value. We also have something called the value keyword, right? So when I return, I say something like this. This dot underscore strength is equal to value. We actually use the value keyword. What value means is when I assign a value, a literal, to this object, right? The value keyword represents that literal. That's what it does, right? So this is an example of both the private instance variable or field, right? So this is private instance variables, right? And these down here, right? If I go triple, right, 1, 2, 3, I can say these are public properties, right? Now, you can do it this way, or if you want to, you can also do it, I'm just going to undo, right? I'm going to undo these comments. The other way to do it is to go / ... and then notice I can go this methodology here, where I can say something like private, this is also correct. It's just a style thing, instance variables, And I can add some decorators if I want to. Not too many, please, because it clutters your code. And then, again, I can do one of these, right, which is, sorry, I got to be that close. And these are public properties. I actually prefer this method because it's also compatible with JavaScript and with Java, right? So these are all my public properties, if I can spell properties well, and these are my public instance or private instance variables, public properties. Now here's one of the advantages are. When I look at my fat bar here on the right, I can see just from a coding style perspective separators. I can see that this line here might be another separating different parts of my code. So why have I shown you this? Because there might be a time, yes? This? Right click on the bar, on the scroll bar, and if you go to scroll bar options, if you really want to, you can choose that I'm going to use map mode for my vertical scroll bar, and I'm going to click on show preview tooltip with a medium source view, source overview. That's what I've done, and press OK. And then it'll give you this preview as I go up and down. You can do the same thing if you really want to see what's in there without actually moving, right? Okay, so why have I shown you this? Because this is a great way. Yes? Am I going to be? Absolutely. Yeah, I will be sending it to GitHub. We do this because it's a quick way of scaffolding out our classes, right? Without actually initially creating all the structure. So it saves on things like finger typing issues. You've typed class wrong, and it's going to save on some issues. It's not lazy, because some people say, well, then I don't know how to make a class, Tom. Yeah, you do, right? You can figure it out. It's not like it's that difficult to make a class. The syntax, if you look at the syntax, is fairly straightforward, right? It's public class character, and then in curly braces, anything that includes that class. One thing we're missing is the constructor. And usually what I want to do is I want to declare my private instance variables here, my public properties here, and then my constructor underneath, right? So my constructor is going to go underneath my public properties, and I can do that, again, if I was going to code it, I would just do one of these, right? So this is where my constructors are going to be. So I can do something like constructors. Let's code this by hand, right, and not use the visual designer for a second, my diagram, and I can do that by hand. And how do I make a constructor again? We did this in the first class. You know, I do public, and then the name of the class, which is character. It doesn't return void, and I can decide whether or not, again, we have what my signature is for my constructor. This is the empty constructor. But I can also add things in there, like, for example, my character should probably have, if I'm going to create my character, I could create a character that has, for example, or my constructor, a name and a race, as an example. Or I can ask for different things in my constructor to initialize my private instance variable or public property, right? Now, even in my constructor, I can always initialize everything, right, with the name of my public property, and that's preferred, right, as opposed to using my instance variables. So if I was to do something like, I want to get the name, I don't have a name yet, but let's say, for example, I want to have a string. I want to take it's going to take two, in my constructor, I need two parameters, a name and let's say, for example, a race. So name and race, right? Now, right now, I don't have name and race for my character. There's no private instance variables or whatever, but if I did, right, then I could certainly do something like in the constructor, I could initialize these values by saying something like this.name, capital N, is equal to name, which is incoming from the parameter, and this.race, capital R, is equal to race, lowercase r. You can do that, right? And that's what we use constructors, right? Now, for now, I'm going to get rid of this because I don't have a constructor in my character, right? And I can use the default empty constructor, which comes with every class. All right, let's take a look at my class diagram. So my class diagram still has these two things. It's not like it's killed those things at all, right? All it's done is it defines that I have a string, and I have a private field or instance variable, and a public property called strength. So what I want you to take away from this is that you can use the class diagram to declare or to create stuff in your code without actually starting things from scratch and coding things from scratch if you don't want to. Again, some professors will say, no, don't show them this stuff because it'll make them lazy. And I say, use all the tools you can because this is rapid application development. We want to make this as quick as we can, right? Any questions around this, right? All right, features. Here's examples, more examples of enumerations, right? So again, you can see that you can say something like, you can specify the values like we talked about instead of just accepting the default 0, 1, and 2, which is what I kind of did with my abilities, right? Okay, and there's some examples of how to use enumerations. One of the things you notice that is that terms, right, is the enumeration type. So this is terms. This is the enumeration type, default type. And the terms of your contract, so when you get paid, for example. So my terms, they declared a variable called t. Very bad. Please don't make variables t's and x's and y's, right? It's got to be something. This is right from the book. You should probably declare a variable lowercase terms. That would be more acceptable. And you can say something like this. Well, terms.net30 is equal to t. T is this, terms net 30. So what is terms net 30? If I didn't know what it was, well, if you go back here, net 30 it has a value of 30. That's the value that it carries with it. But it means something more than as saying that t is equal to 30. T is equal to 30 means nothing when I first look at it. What does that mean, right? And then what I can do is I can cast a value. I can assign a value like this. I can say, I can cast that terms.net30, I can cast it as an integer and assign it into an integer variable, right? And so on. Okay, it's very easy to use. You can also cast it as a string, and so it says net 30 days, and all that kind of stuff. It's very easy to use enumerations, and they're very, I think it's a very useful construct. Okay, I'm not going to be talking about null values in this course. It's kind of an advanced topic. I want you to think about a null value as an optional, right? So I have optional variables. I declare it with a quotation mark. If I use a quotation mark, if you see the syntax like this, so int quotation mark quantity, it's an optional. That's what it is. Or what C# calls nullables, right? And if you've never heard of this before, again, like I said, it's an advanced concept. It allows us to declare or to assign a value of null to any data type, which is a new feature of C#, right? It's something that we didn't have before. In past iterations of C#, we had to declare a literal value that matches the data type. Here we can say it's null, which means it doesn't really have a value. And then we can check to see if it's been assigned. So an example of this would be like this. If I say, does this variable, does it have a value? If it's true, if the value if the nullable type contains a value, right? So if it's the optional type has a value like 1, 2, 3, 4, if it was an integer, and returns false if it's null, right? So this is a great way of saying, did I initialize these variables? If they're not initialized and they're null, then I can do something. I can check for that. It's another way of checking to see if what the optional, I like to call them optionals, what they have, which is it's kind of the same thing, right? Make sense? Are we going to use these in our course? No, I'm not going to use them. They're advanced, but if you ever see the notation, that's what I'm talking about. I'm just looking at syntax right now, so you understand what it is. Am I going to test you on this in a test? No, I'm not going to test you on it. But if you look at the book and it asks you, or if you look somewhere else from a C# perspective, you should understand what this represents. Okay, that's it for PowerPoint number 1. I'm not going to talk about anything else in this PowerPoint. Let's take a short break, and when we do, I can answer some questions. And then I'm going to, in the second half, what I want to do is I want to build out my splash screen, and I'm also going to be referring back to PowerPoint number 2 when I do that. Okay?